Thank you, folks out there, for joining us for another virtual event. My name is Liz. I'm with the Chicago Museum, and I am very excited to welcome my friend Liz Williams from the Southern Food and Beverage Museum down in New Orleans. Whenever I introduce Liz, I have to give the full backstory on how we met. And the reason we met was because when I was starting to build the Chicago Museum, I wanted to see what else was out there, and there was really nothing that was really focused on food and or beverage. And one of the places that I did find was the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. And I sent Liz an email, and an amazing thing happened. And that amazing thing is that she actually replied to my email. You'd be surprised at how many people don't reply to random emails. So that kicked off a good relationship and friendship, and we've done collaborations together both in Chicago and in New Orleans. In fact, the very first collaborative beer the museum ever did was with the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and a couple of breweries here in Chicago and in New Orleans, and we celebrated the shared connections between Chicago and New Orleans. So Liz is not only a museum founder, a museum person, she's also an author and a historian, and of course specializing in a handful of different Southern cuisines and such, but New Orleans is certainly near and dear to her heart, and certainly a topic of one of her books. So those of you here on Zoom, please use that chat room for your questions. We'll get to the Q&A at the end. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, hi, thanks for being here. And please ask your questions down below in the comment section, and we'll get to those and integrate them into the Q&A at the end. And with that, I'm going to scoot, and we're going to have all eyes and ears on Liz, and I'll let you take it over. And again, Liz, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Liz. I love that. We're both Liz. It really gives me the opportunity to talk about my very favorite thing, which is all the storytelling about food and drink. And especially when it has to do with New Orleans, I'm particularly excited. So I'm going to spend my time kind of talking to you about how I came to some of this information and give you my theories, and we're going to talk about food and drink, not just food and not just drink, because they really go together. So when we opened the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do was to tell the story of the food and how it was developed in New Orleans. And I thought it would be really easy to read a few books and get all of that I needed. But unfortunately, there really isn't a whole lot. There is material about particular dishes, and so you can sort of trace back to some extent some of the origins of particular dishes. But when you start to talk about the entire cuisine and all of the food of New Orleans, there's really very little written. The most you could find was things in usually the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which would be introductions to various cookbooks about Creole cuisine. And in those introductions, they would talk about, oh, you take the food of Africa, the food of Europe, and the food of America, and abracadabra, it comes together, and now you have a cuisine. Well, that's not a very good way to describe this, and it's certainly not an explanation. And if it would be an explanation, you would be able to look at the same ethnic groups that were part of the take a little bit of Africa, take a little bit of America, and a little bit of Europe in Savannah and Charleston and all these other places. And they should have developed this kind of cuisine also, and they didn't. So I decided that I had to find the answer to this. And so really it was in order to inform the Southern Food and Beverage Museum that I went on this quest So I began to read a lot about cuisine, and Sidney Mintz, who was an anthropologist who did a lot of work in sugar and the sugar industry, said that there are three elements to cuisine. One is everybody in a particular region eats the same thing. So that means that if you're living in a place where there's slavery, as we were here in New Orleans, that the masters and the enslaved people eat the same thing in order for it to be a cuisine. Number two, it has to be part of the cultural identity of the place. And number three, everyone who eats it and knows it recognizes it when they eat it. And that is what you need in order to be able to say that your food, your everyday food of the people, is a cuisine. So I thought, well, we do have a cuisine in New Orleans. We absolutely have a sense of identity around our food. Everyone can recognize it. And I say this because I know that we who grew up in New Orleans can tell the difference between Creole food and Cajun food, for example. So these are foods that developed very close to each other, and you may include both of them in the food of Louisiana, but the food of New Orleans is different from the food of the Cajun region. And we can tell the difference just when it's put on a plate. And also, everyone eats the same thing. So everyone eats red beans and rice, not just an underclass. Everyone eats this food. So with all of those things together, I think that we can say for sure that New Orleans has a cuisine. So then that gave me the
Why there isn't
impetus to say, why do we have a cuisine? And because it is true that some of these same ethnic groups that came together in New Orleans also came together in other parts of the South. I think that the big difference is that in New Orleans, the food came together because we were in a French colony and not an English colony. So we can sort of set aside the politics of, is it right to form a colony? Did we usurp this area from the native people who were here? Was it right to bring enslaved Africans here? All of those things they are just done. And so we should take the fact that they happened and see how they came together to shape the food. So if you think about the time that this is happening, New Orleans was founded in 1718. And so at this time, you're really at sort of the center of the Age of Reason. When we study the Age of Reason in school, and even when we study the colonies that formed the beginnings of America in school, we're talking about the English colonies. And when we study the Age of Reason, we're reading the English writers of the time. And so we see the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment, however you want to think of it, as applying rationality to science. And so you get Darwin and people like that. Or we're applying rationality to government. When we don't read, even in translation, when we're studying the Age of Reason, when we do that, we find that we have logic and reason applied to the arts and not to science necessarily. And so that was a big difference between France and England. And so once you start thinking of that, you also know that the French considered cuisine one of the arts. And so in applying reason, you had people who ate, and so they had to understand food in order to appreciate it. And you had people who made the food, and they are the artists who did that. But you can't appreciate the food if you don't understand it. So that was the mindset that was here. Another thing was true is that the English considered there to be England and the colonies. And if you were colonies, you weren't in England. So in order to maintain your English identity, you needed to eat like an English person, dress like journals that were found in settlements where everyone had died. People actually wrote, "We don't want to eat like a savage." So even though there was food there, people said that they would rather starve to death than eat like a savage. Whereas in the French way of thinking of this was not a colony. This was as much France as it was to be in Europe, in the country that we now think of as France. So because of that, if you were here and you ate an alligator, you were eating a French alligator. And so because you were eating French food while you were here, you didn't have the sense of isolation from your roots, because the roots were simply expanding. So I'm not saying that the food that was eaten here was French food or French inspired food. Who came here would say that, because certainly eating an alligator wasn't French. But it was French because the French considered this to be part of France. So that meant it was possible for all the people who were here to accept the foodstuffs that they found here and eat them and embrace them, because this was not different. This was France. So you have all of the native peoples who are contributing the sources of food, telling people where the oyster beds are, letting them know about sassafras, so that they could thicken their soups and their things that became gumbo. They're letting people know about pecans and how to eat them and other things that are native to this area. There was some trading, so that you had peppers, you had tomatoes, you had all kinds of things that were not things that were known in Europe, but nevertheless they formed something that became very important as the basic infrastructure of the food of New Orleans, and that was the food that was available here. So then in addition to that, you had the enslaved Africans who were brought here, and they also brought their techniques, and they brought certain foodstuffs with them. So many of the people who were brought over on the slave ships were brought over with foods that were native to Africa, or at least were well cultivated in Africa. And so they were familiar foods. So you would bring over okra, and you bring other foodstuffs with you here to New Orleans. And then once they got here, because of the climate, they grew well. So then they became adopted and incorporated into the foods of America. For example, rice is one of those things. Rice was brought to the Carolinas, but it was also brought to Louisiana. And the enslaved people came with the technology, and they knew how to grow rice, and it grew well here. So you have rice, you had beans, which are American, and you had peas, which were African. And the idea of eating rice and peas in Africa also became eating rice and beans in New Orleans. So you had also a very African method of cooking was frying. And so that was something else that we did a lot of. By the time that the city was founded, the Spanish had brought enough pigs over to have wild pigs everywhere. And in addition, they brought chickens, and chickens were something that could be domesticated by the European people who were of European descent who came here, so that they could have eggs and chickens, things that they were used to in Europe. So all of these peoples came together, and you started to have something that melded together into what began as just survival, But because of the Enlightenment and the desire to have the artistic value of what was eaten appreciated, they wanted it to taste good. And so they began to apply the idea of, of art to cooking. And so there was then something that began to develop into a cuisine. And there was this ability to use what was here, which was something that distinguished New Orleans from some of the English colonies. Now, in addition, you had things that were brought over here. So you had wine, you had Madeira, you had other kinds of spirits like cognac and other brandies. And then, of course, because you were growing sugar here, because sugar began to be grown in Louisiana, you had everybody was making their own rum. So you had that growing, you had many, many things that started to form the basis of a cuisine. Then, of course, the Spanish came. And then Louisiana, New Orleans was ceded to the Spanish. And when that happened, then you had some additional things that became introduced here. One of those things was the array of spices that were used in Spain. And so all of a sudden, the idea of using spices to make the food even more artistically appealing was very big. And so that happened here also in New Orleans. And another aspect of it was the influence of the enslaved Africans who, because of the Code Noir, which was the code of law that affected the people who were enslaved, they had to be baptized Catholic and they had to have Sunday off, and they were given the ability to sell wares, and so they did that. They made candies of pecans that grew wild. They sold coffee because at that time you had to fast from midnight in order to go to mass and receive communion, and almost everybody was Roman Catholic. So they would stand outside of the churches, and when they emptied, people wanted a cup of coffee. So they were able to buy it, and they bought kala, which are fried rice balls. And those also were things that, excuse me, just a second. Can you get that there? That, thanks. My apologies. Those were fried rice fritters, and they were sweetened with sugar, and they were a delicious thing to eat with the coffee that you ate outside of the church. So all of these things started to become part of the expectation of what you would eat, and they were all delicious. And we had great bounty here. So you had shrimp and oysters and finfish. People were eating frogs' legs and turtles and deer and pork and chicken and other birds like ducks. And then, of course, people ate bear, used the bear fat for many, many things. There was just an enormous amount of bounty. And that, of course, didn't hurt. And so with all of those things together, you have this absolutely exciting kind of feeling of richness and artistry in food. It even became important culturally to set out the table beautifully and to make sure that it was served with flowers, and using the sugar to make little sugar sculptures on the table and all of those kinds of things. So it was really, really important. So we'll get to some of the later immigration that happened after we became American, and then after into the 19th century. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about the alcohol. So once again, let's talk about the founding. When we were founded, there was really not a lot of money in France. I think England and Spain and the Netherlands had huge, huge armies and huge, huge navies. France did not. France spent all of its money much more frivolously than going out and conquering the rest of the world. They wanted to conquer and they wanted to be a powerhouse in Europe, but they didn't have quite the money to do it. So that meant in order to fund the colony, they actually would auction tavern licenses. And so the more tavern licenses that were sold and the more money that you got from those licenses, the more the city founders had money to spend on who knows what. So they had money to operate the city, and it depended on how much alcohol was sold, where it was sold, and how it was taxed after it was sold. So they got two things from those licenses. One was actually the purchase price at auction to buy the license, and then the secondary money they got was the tax on the alcohol that was sold. And if you read anything about unlicensed taverns, the complaint is not, oh, the riffraff that goes to unlicensed taverns. The complaint is, we're not getting money from those people. That's what was the problem. And so that's something that I think we all have to keep in mind, that when the city is founded on alcohol, it really goes deep. In addition to that, the church was very important because the church actually used alcohol, used wine in its religious rituals. So because of that, there was not even the sort of Puritan taint that there might be to alcohol. And so it was something that was culturally important. People considered wine especially to be food. Wine and beer both were food. They contributed calories to your diet, and they were something that you drank because it was part of the table. Spirits were a little different. Spirits were a grown-up thing, but children drank wine and beer. So it was something that that was just part of the culture of the place. And so even when the Spanish came, they continued the practice of funding the city by the sale or auction of tavern licenses. So with all of that, you're importing alcohol from Spain, from France, all of that. And so it's something that everyone recognizes as just a part of life. When it does have that kind of connotation that this is just like breathing air, it has a kind of a different aspect, and it's not frowned upon or anything like that. And there was a sort of sense that drinking should be civilized, which means that yes, you get drunk, but you can only get drunk in times and places that are pre-approved. Like you could get drunk at a wedding, or you could get drunk at a funeral, or some other occasion that was particularly important. But you also didn't do it on a regular basis if you were of a certain class or whatever, because that was it was just simply not done. So that also is an overlay on the drinking. People will find on the internet that it says that the cocktail was invented in New Orleans, but that really isn't true. I mean, there's really no evidence that there was no cocktail before there were cocktails in New Orleans. But I will say that New Orleans is the keeper of the cocktail flame for sure. And so you'll find that we invented many cocktails, and the names of bartenders here from the 19th century are very well known. The Ramus Gin Fizz, the Crusta, which is the precursor to the sidecar. All of those things really were founded and rooted in New Orleans because we were very experimental even early on. When Santini invented the Crusta, he was the first person to crust the rim with sugar. And also, he's credited with being the first person to really use citrus peel as a flavoring in alcohol. So there's a lot of opportunity here, but it also was because citrus was here. So because of the bounty that we had, we were a port city, we were close to the water, we had really great alluvial soil because the Mississippi River was constantly overflowing. And so the soil was rich and would grow anything that would tolerate the climate. So we had just lots and lots of riches here. Not necessarily lots of money, but a richness in raw materials for cooking and eating. So let's move on into America and how America came to be something that influenced us here. So in 1803, we had the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this was the time that Jefferson decided that um, there was time to expand. And so he offered money to Napoleon, and Napoleon took it. And so we came, we had been Spanish at this time. The Spanish ceded Louisiana and New Orleans back to France. And then everyone here really was rejoicing, thinking that they would be French again. But no, Napoleon betrayed them all and sold all of this land to America, that new country. And everybody became American. And that changed a lot of things. Certainly because we had been one of those places where we were living far away from government, or big government. There was a lot of smuggling. There was a lot of looseness about paying taxes and all of that sort of thing. We didn't really rely on government because they were not always sending us things that were promised. And so, there was a real thumb your nose attitude at government. And all of a sudden, Americans started to come here. Now, the people who were of French descent, and even the ones who were Spanish, did not have a great opinion of Americans. First of all, Americans spoke English, that ugly language. You spoke French or you spoke Spanish, it seemed like such a beautiful language. And then you would have to learn how to speak English, number one. Number two, the rule of law was very important. And the people here were not used to actually obeying the law. So that took a lot of getting used to. And also, they saw that instead of wanting to live in order to have a pleasant life, people lived to make money. And that was something that was anathema to the people of New Orleans. And so it was really, really hard. It was really hard at the beginning. But what it meant was that goods from all over America, as the Mississippi River was taking in and the drainage of about 2/3 of America, all the things, cranberries, flour from the wheat that was grown in the Northeast, rye whiskey, all kinds of things started to come down the Mississippi River and found itself in New Orleans. And then New Orleans is starting to ship things everywhere. So we, of course, had been shipping coffee since before the city of New Orleans was here. But also you had bananas and you had pineapples and you had all sorts of things that were coming. It was an enormous bounty on top of the natural bounty that was already here. And so this attitude that the French and then the Spanish had about cooking and eating simply embraced all of the foodstuffs that came here. And so that added yet another layer of really open opportunity to the food of the area. So as we get into the 19th century, probably the biggest influence after, of course, becoming American was in the alcohol department was absinthe. So New Orleans became the absinthe drinking capital of America. And that was because even though we became a state in 1812, the home language of most people was still French. Everyone spoke English by the time of 1812. However, the ties to France were still very strong. And so as people began to drink absinthe in Paris, it became something that people drank here in New Orleans. For example, Edgar Degas, who is the great painter, who also painted that wonderful painting called The Absinthe Drinker, came to visit his family that lived in New Orleans. He lived here for about 90 days, and he wrote home and said, "I'm so happy that I didn't try to learn English because I'm finding that everybody here speaks French." And this was in the 1880s. And people were still getting journals and newspapers from France. And so they were following French trends and all of that kind of thing. And since absinthe was very popular in France, it was very popular here. We had a number of absinthe houses, and that was something that I think is probably not really known. But there were actually ads in New York when an absinthe house opened there that said, "We drink absinthe here in New York just the way they do in New Orleans." We were that famous at the time for our absinthe drinking. The food was very highly influenced in the late 19th century by the huge influx of people from Sicily to New Orleans. So between about 1885 and 1915, tens of thousands of people from Sicily came directly to New Orleans. These are not people who came through Ellis Island. They came directly to New Orleans. So right after the Civil War, the enslaved people were emancipated, and they left the cane fields of the sugar fields, which you can't blame them at all. But the cane farmers were worried about finding specialized labor who would know how to work in the cane fields. So what they did was they decided, the labor department of the state of Louisiana decided to open up a labor office, a recruitment office in Palermo, Sicily, because Sicily was a place where sugarcane was grown. So they thought they'd be able to find sugarcane workers who were experienced, who could just come to Louisiana and work on the cane fields. So their way was paid. They were essentially indentured servants that had to work off their passage. And when they did that, they also left the cane fields. But what happened was some of them did not go back after the period of their passage, and they stayed here in the New Orleans area. And because of that, when the people needed to leave Sicily in 1885 or later, most of them knew somebody or had a relative or knew someone who was already in Louisiana. So they were coming to a place where they felt that they would find somebody that they could relate to. So that kind of brought a lot of people to Louisiana. One of the ways that you can get a job when you don't speak the language is to get a job in food. So if you can cook or you can grow food or something like that, you are going to be able to find money. So a lot of people became truck farmers. They would get land outside of the city and they would bring in the food. Some of them opened restaurants. There were a lot of people were living from Sicily were living in the French Quarter. It became known as Little Palermo. And they say that second only to Palermo, New Orleans was the city where the most people spoke the Sicilian dialect. So that's how many people were living here who were from Sicily. We had what they used to call macaroni factories all over the city. And so people began to um, eat a lot of what we would now think of as pasta. They became bakers. There just was so much. And then because they also were butchers and other things, they worked in the French market. They started importing food using their contacts in in Sicily, so that more lemons came into the port of New Orleans than any other place in America for a time. And so many so many lemons were brought in that during the canning process, when citric acid began to be added as a preservative in canning, all of the citric acid was taken from the lemons that were being brought from Sicily through the port of New Orleans. And it prompted Florida and later California to be places where domestically lemons could be grown. Those same people who began by importing lemons to America and selling them all over the country also were bringing in bananas, pineapples, and other things from Central America and South America and the whole Caribbean. So there were many, many fruits that were being brought in. So that's then when you get the United Fruit Company and Standard Fruit Company and all of those fruit companies. And many of them had a huge Sicilian influence in their founding. In New Orleans, we have the muffaletta, we have the snowball, we have so many things that are related to the Italians who they would call themselves Sicilians, who came to New Orleans. And so much of it is absorbed that things and tomatoes so much a part of our food that we don't think about it. Nobody thinks that a meatball po' boy is Italian. So this continued on into the 20th century with the 1970s and the Vietnam War ending, and huge numbers of people from Vietnam came to New Orleans, partially because they could be fishermen here, but also because it was still a Catholic place, and Catholic charities brought a lot of refugees here to New Orleans. So we have our city, and I think that the things that is the most exciting is that attitude about food. And you can hear a grandmother say, which is, "Oh, you can cook, come sit next to me." And nobody
Everybody looks like we lost Liz Williams. I'm sure she'll be rejoining as soon as she can. In the meantime, don't forget to add any questions and thoughts and comments you might have in the chat box. And yeah, we look forward to getting to those in a little while.
Liz had some internet issues. I was actually having some internet issues as well. Hopefully she realizes it and comes back for some Q&A, but I think she was actually just getting to the end of her presentation. Before I jump into some museum stuff, when life gets back to normal and you guys are able, if you're not in New Orleans, if you're able to get to New Orleans, what Liz has built with the Southern Food and Beverage Museum is pretty exciting. Their story started out very grassroots, and it went into a building, a warehouse area right on the river that had been affected by Katrina. And the reason that they were able to do that was because of Katrina. The developers there said, we can't use the space. We know you're building a museum, get on in there. And they were able to grow the organization physically in that space. And eventually they were given a building by a local company. And they are located in the heart of New Orleans, just on the other side of the highway by the French Quarter, if you've ever been. and really just kind of focuses on specific displays of the cuisine of different states in the South. Within the Southern Food and Beverage Museum is also my t-shirt here, the Museum of the American Cocktail, where they have various paraphernalia related to cocktail history and culture. Of course, there's a whole display on absinthe, as Liz was getting into. So if you get there, and the other great thing too is that one of the ways they're able to sustain their operations is that they have a great restaurant in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. It's called Toop South, and the chef there has been well known. I believe he was a Top Chef contestant. But the food and the cocktails there are actually quite amazing, and so it's a great little experience to go have a spin around the museum and then have some authentic New Orleans cuisine. What I will also say about the Southern Food and Beverage Museum is that when Liz was starting to do a lot of her research and growing the entity, she realized that it became the Southern Food and Beverage Museum because she realized that New Orleans cuisine, while, as she was explaining, is its cuisine in and of itself, the South has such a strong food culture that she really needed to integrate all of it. And so that's how it eventually evolved. That kept evolving into much more as people were learning about the organization. So she created an organization called the National Food and Beverage Foundation. And that actually has now is the umbrella organization which oversees the Museum of the American Cocktail, the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. They have a whole slew of archives of various sort of like homegrown, you know, when you go to like say a church gathering, a social gathering, or any sort of just social dining, I guess, informal dining experience, you often have people making little pamphlets. They have that. Hey Liz, you're back.
I'm back. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No problem. I was just talking about the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and the National Food and Beverage Foundation and your libraries and all the great stuff that you guys do. So that's where I took it because I certainly couldn't finish your presentation. But I'll let you get back to it. But I literally was just talking about your library of the different sort of homegrown, handmade recipe books that people would pass out at various smaller sort of gatherings. And because those aren't really official publicized or published books, the Library of Congress won't take them. So people have collected them, and you actually now are the holder of all those amazing recipes, which I think is incredibly valuable.
It's really exciting and wonderful. And you know, really, I was really close to finishing. My apologies. We lost electricity, and so of course the internet went out, and it all came back in like a flash. But then you have to let it all come back on and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really sorry. Who knows why that happened?
I'll let you wrap it up, but what we'll do is if you just want to sort of conclude what you're saying, and we will let everybody just ask some questions while we have Liz, and we can get back into some of the National Food and Beverage Foundation entities if you'd like. And then we can also talk about one thing that I think is sort of a fun fact that people don't know about you and your family, and we'll plug at the end. So I'm going to take it for a second, and then you can keep going.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to finish up by saying that I think that one of the most exciting things about our food is, and certainly the Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005, is probably the latest example of that, is that after that was over, we had a lot of people from initially Mexico, but later all of Central America come to New Orleans as a part of the rebuilding effort. And because of that, we started eating oyster tacos and all kinds of foods that are very influenced by the tastes and flavors of Mexico and Central America, but they've become ours. And we're just always open to that. And I think it's the thing that keeps us alive. So I started to talk to you about the 1984 World's Fair. Journalists came and they began to eat in what was then called the Louisiana Pavilion of the fair. And all the people of Louisiana were represented in this one place, and they were serving all kinds of food. So they were serving crawfish, and they were serving all these other things. And the journalists didn't know whether it was Cajun food, whether it was Creole food. They just knew it was in the Louisiana Pavilion, so it must be Louisiana food. And they called it Cajun Creole or Creole Cajun, sometimes with a slash, sometimes with a dash. And that was the best that they could do in terms of identifying it. Often they were here for 2 or 3 days, and then they had to go write stories and things. So they weren't here long enough to really sort it out. But it made a lot of articles in a lot of magazines and newspapers, and people started to come to New Orleans and ask for Cajun food. And once that happened, restaurants, because they accommodate people, began to accommodate people. And so Cajun food is now also available here, and it has kind of become the food of Louisiana. All of it can be found here in New Orleans today. So I just love the fact that it's not dead. You know, it's not like frozen in time. It's something that is still alive, and because of that, it continues to change, which is exciting. Okay, Liz, you were asking me about some of the other aspects of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum and NatFAB and the National Food and Beverage Foundation, which is our parent organization. Do you want me to talk about that, or do you want to ask me questions, or how do you want to do that?
Yeah, well, I'll pepper in some questions here and there, but I think it's important for people to understand that the Southern Food and Beverage Museum is just one of a slew of things that you're doing. And you know, I know that you started with New Orleans and really then the South, but you're really sort of growing nationally. I'll let you talk about the other museum and just really I think it's important to just highlight some of the different entities that you guys have under the National Food and Beverage Foundation.
Well, so we now consider the Southern Food and Beverage Museum to be our flagship project. But in addition to that, we have our library, which has over 20,000 volumes now and a growing archive. We've been fortunate enough to find that chefs are starting to donate some of their papers. Authors are giving us papers and things that support their writing. So our archives also have many pamphlets, and then of course we have that great selection of community cookbooks that you talked about, Liz. So that also, we have entrepreneurship programs which we're trying to duplicate around the country. We have something called the National Culinary Heritage Register, and the register is a recognition that not only do physical places and ideas need to be recognized as architectural and having architectural importance, but they should be recognized because they have culinary importance. So we recognize anything that is over 50 years old. So that could be breweries, it could be distilleries, it could be manufacturing facilities like chocolate factories and candy making factories and flour mills and just everything. Also grocery stores and restaurants and bars and even places that manufacture equipment for manufacturing food and things like that. So all of those things, we're trying to amass a database of places that are 50 years old or older, because all of those places have contributed to the food of America. And in addition to that, now we have the Nitty Grits Network. And so I have a podcast, and there are many podcasts on that network. We are working on the Southern Food and Beverage Museum cookbook, which I'm really excited about. And we also are reaching out to places like the museum and other museums around the country that are relating themselves to food and drink, or which are expanding existing museums to include foodways and drinkways as a part of their reflection of the culture of their place. So those are all things that we're working on. We're really working hard on right now. So we we started out being local and regional, but it seems that there was a need for more, and so we hope that we can be a catalyst to help this happen as a phenomenon all over the country, that there be food and drink museums, places where people can gather, and the only way to do it is to be the person who helps make it happen, or be the place that can help. Because once we got on our feet, we realized that other people were trying to get on their feet too, and we can all help each other, because really rising tides float all boats.
Yeah, I appreciate you answering that email. Like I said, you're integral in helping me understand some of the trickier aspects of what it meant to get started with not just a 501c3, but a museum, a very a niche museum. So thanks for paving the way. And I'm glad that we can continue to work together in these capacities as we also grow. I'm going to get to some questions here that folks have. Mike and Annette want to know if you can talk about yakimein.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Hard to find, folks are saying. Yeah, just a little bit about that, please.
So yakimein is one of the great mysteries. There was a period of time when nobody was really researching it, and there's a woman named Linda Green who is the yakimein lady, and she sells yakimein every year at Jazz Fest, and has a pop-up all over the place here in New Orleans where she sells her yakimein. So she says, and others have said, that this it's a noodle bowl. It's like a soup that's made with spaghetti, but also has an egg in it. It's usually made with either pork or beef, and it's spicy, very much like any kind of noodle bowl, whether it's pho or ramen or whatever. And it was thought to have been brought back by African American soldiers from Korea. And so they ate noodle bowls in Korea, and they came back and kind of reconstructed it with what was available here in New Orleans. It's called Old Sober because it's also thought to be a great hangover remedy to have a bowl of yakimein. And where the actual term comes from is supposedly some kind of corruption of something that might have been picked up in Korea. But there's a historian here in New Orleans. His name is Winston Ho, and he has been doing a lot of research into the origins of yakimein, and now it is really thought to have been found on early Chinese menus as one of the listings. And so the idea that it was first introduced after the Korean War doesn't seem to be a plausible reason to give as an origin story anymore. The more Winston finds out, the more and the more he researches, the more it seems that it really is something of Chinese origin, and that was brought to the city and other places probably on Chinese menus and introduced to people. And it would be very plausible to think that people of Chinese descent who were in New Orleans would have lived in the areas where African Americans might have lived, and there could have been a lot of cross-cultural exchange. And So that's really what is thought of yakame today. I don't understand the question about it being hard to find. It's not something that you find every day somewhere, and that's because it's kind of a specialized dish. That's, I would say that. But in a lot of African American restaurants, you can find it, and there's a lot of takeout.
I can understand why people might say that the name of it is related to a hangover cure because if I am hungover, the first thing I'm looking for is a bowl of pho or ramen.
Yes,
Do the trick.
yeah.
Lucas wants to know is the main thread to your talk today was about Catholicism. And his question is, does Catholicism remain especially prevalent in New Orleans in contrast to the surrounding areas and states, and why?
Um, could you, especially prevalent in New Orleans in contrast to the surrounding areas and states? Okay, so Catholicism was the religion of the French. And so since this area was, and I'm using the word colonized loosely, but colonized by the French, that became the established religion. And of course, priests came with them. The first people in New Orleans to grow sugar were the Jesuits, who were left here before even the founding of the city, but they were left here to begin converting the Native Americans, and they grew sugar cane just to make syrup and such out of it to sweeten whatever it was they were eating. And of course, they also made rum, but uh, it was because of the French that it became Catholic, and all of Louisiana below, say, Baton Rouge has remained pretty Catholic. And then the Spanish came after the French still in the 18th century, and they also were Catholic, and they actually brought the Inquisition with them to New Orleans and the area. And so that's why it was Roman Catholic. And I think that the Roman Catholic religion was a lot more tolerant of alcohol than some of the Protestant ones.
Well, for those of us who grew up Catholic, we know that wine is certainly a main player in all of it. So that's not surprising either.
Right. And then, of course, the Sicilians that came, they were Catholic. And the group of people from Vietnam who came here, they were Catholic. I mean, we've had, a lot of, and people who came from Central America and South America, like the Brazilians who came with the coffee industry and all of that kind of stuff, because we were the importing port for coffee, all of them were Catholic.
I was actually really it was curious for me to hear from you that there was such a prevalent Sicilian presence and culture there. Does that still exist? Was there ever like a tradition of drinking limoncello in New Orleans?
There's a lot of limoncello in New Orleans, yes. And there's actually an Italian American Cultural Center here that has a little museum and celebrates a lot of the Sicilian contributions to the city beyond just food. I mean, certainly it covers food, but we have in March, on March 19th, which is St. Joseph's Day, we celebrate St. Joseph's Day. It is across the whole city, so you don't have to be Catholic or anything like that in order to celebrate St. Joseph's Day. And just like Mardi Gras, all of our religious holidays morph into just cultural holidays. And so we just have managed to continue on a lot of the Sicilian traditions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think in thinking a lot about what you've discussed today, and actually having visited New Orleans several times, is how there is such a unique, just cross-cultural embracing of all of these foods and drinks, and really sort of being integrated into kind of all aspects of life. It's fascinating.
And I really believe that that was that French overlay. I mean, the winners, you know, write the history. So not talking about all of the various influences, but when you look at the overview of the history, it was that French attitude that this is all French. So we can embrace it without fear. And it's very different from the English, or, and I will say, somewhat American view that that's not American or that's not English. And it's not the prevalent view here. It's like, if it's here, it's ours.
Right.
If you eat it here, it's New Orleans food, you know.
Right.
And it's great.
So out of all of the different kinds of food that New Orleans is known for, right? Is there one that people from New Orleans are sort of like, stop talking about it? In Chicago, for example, I think for us, it's deep dish pizza, right? Because most Chicagoans don't actually really eat it that much. I'll have it every now and then, right? But you have people come in and they're like, show me the deep dish. Is there an equivalent of that in New Orleans for you?
Well, I think people are always asking. It's not the eating of it, but they're always asking, where's the best gumbo? And the answer to that question is not a particular restaurant. It's like, oh, at my house or at my aunt's house or, you know, at my best friend's house or whatever, because we still eat it and make it at home,
right?
Which is very different from where's the restaurant where I can go to get the best, that whatever.
Yeah.
And that's more the attitude I think that we have about our food, that the best food, you can have a fabulous meal at a lot of restaurants. So I'm not trying to take that away.
Yeah.
But the best food is still at home.
Right. Right.
And that's what people who come to visit, you know, you want somebody to invite you to their house because that's where you're going to get good food.
Yeah. I definitely think that we have that issue here too. And people ask, hey, where's the best restaurant? And we're like, well, give me some direction, right? We have so many. Okay, we are past time, but I'm going to wrap it up by letting people know that Liz not only runs an amazing foundation and other organizations, including the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, and she's not only an author of one book, but many books, another one coming out. I want to ask you to plug that book one more time. But the other thing is that Liz's son, Mark, is actually a pretty well-known comedian who has been on all the late night talk shows, and you can find him on YouTube, right? So I think we should give Mark a plug.
Absolutely. So my son is Mark Normand, and he recently put an hour-long special on YouTube that is called Out to Lunch. Over 2.3 million views so far. And please watch it. You can easily find it on YouTube. And it's just really, he's been on everything, all the late night talk shows and all that kind of thing. And I'm really proud of him. Yeah.
A lot of his bits include talking about his parents.
Yes,
sometimes not that favorable. I often wonder how you feel about that.
Well, so much of it I know is just made up.
Yeah.
That you know, when he first started, he did one thing which I think is really funny. He would tell a joke and he would talk about his sister, and of course he doesn't have a sister, and so I know he just makes it up, and if it makes it funnier to be about his parents did this or that, that's what he does, you know. So.
Right. Southernfood.org is where you can go find more information about the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. You can connect to all the other entities we discussed with Liz. My friend Liz Williams, thank you so much for being with us and sharing your knowledge. Go buy her books. When you get back to New Orleans, everybody, visit Southern Food and Beverage Museum. Support all of your food and beverage organizations, nonprofits, museums, and people. We need you now more than ever. Again, Liz, thanks for joining us. Everybody out here on Zoom and Facebook, appreciate you supporting us. ChicagoBruseum.org is where you can find more information. And next week, we have author Tom Esatelli, who is going to discuss his new book about Pilsner. He's more, I guess, well known for his book called The Audacity of Hops. And he's going to discuss all things Pilsner next week with us. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And Liz, hopefully the next time we chat, maybe it'll be in person.
Oh, that would be wonderful.
I know. I think it's my time to come visit you. So.
Oh, I'm up for going to Chicago.
All right, you're welcome anytime. All right, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.